August 19th, 1989. A balmy summer evening, and a young Portuguese banker and Cambridge graduate, Antonio de Vasconcellos, is hosting a party for his 26th birthday on the pleasure boat Marchioness. Most of his guests are also in their early 20s. It's a savvy, entrepreneurial crowd of fashion designers, models, journalists, and financiers. Antonio's friend, Jonathan Pang, organised much of the event, including the DJ and catering. Naturally, he wants to amaze Antonio with a memorable night. And it's the 1980s after all, a time of heightened ambitions, punk rock, neon lights. Aboard the cruise, Antonio's party boasts all the excesses of the decades, blaring music, disco lights, and 130 guests. They're ready to dance on the Thames until 6 in the morning. But just behind them rears the front end of a huge, ugly dredger, and it's bearing down on them with great speed. Antonio's party was meant to be a celebration, but it became one of Britain's worst peacetime maritime disasters. Not a tragedy on the open ocean, but one in full view of the public in one of the largest cities on Earth. The horrifying accident was bad enough, but the course of the investigation and the actions of the authorities would cement the Marchioness as a tragedy that remains just as painful today as it did 37 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs, and this is the story of the Marchioness, the tragic sinking of a London party boat. Marchioness was built by the Salter brothers in London, England in 1923, 8 years after a running mate, the Hurlingham, was launched. At 85 feet or 26 metres long and only 17 feet or 5.2 metres wide, she had a shallow 4-foot draft. This left Marchioness a slender, diminutive vessel that could turn erratically. In a strong current, a 34-ton bulk could veer off course by force of the river itself. But she was built to a formula common for river pleasure boats at the time. The Salter brothers had been commissioned to build her for the businessman Joe Mears, who was also the co-founder of the Chelsea Football Club. The Marchioness joined the largest fleet of passenger launches on the River Thames that Mears operated through his company, Joseph Mears Launches and Motors Limited. The pleasure boat sailed her passengers up and down the Thames winding reaches with her powerful steam engine, and day trippers enjoyed uninterrupted views of the city sprawling on either side of the bank. But when the world plunged yet again into war in 1939, the Marchioness would go on to serve a far more austere purpose. The decks, no longer filled with sightseers watching the glistening waters of the Thames, were instead filled with casualties of war. In 1940, she was repurposed into a hospital boat for the Thames Hospital Emergency Service, essentially acting as a floating ambulance. She went on to help rescue British troops as one of the little ships from the beach at Dunkirk during Operation Dynamo. After the war, Thames Launches bought the Marchioness in 1946, keeping her for 31 years, before she passed through several other party boat operators and was acquired by Tidal Cruises Limited in 1979. It was then that she underwent her most radical transformation yet. The once open vessel was rebuilt with 3 enclosed decks. She was fitted with a bar, a reception area, an upper saloon, and dance floors. After the upgrade, the Marchioness became a floating event space for lavish parties that could accommodate up to 130 passengers. However, her upper saloon rose higher than her wheelhouse, which blocked vision from behind. The upper decks now essentially rose up like a hunchback. To see behind him, the helmsman would need to leave the ship's wheel, climb some steps on the wheelhouse's aft bulkhead and peer through a hatch in the deck head there, or go to the side of the boat and lean over. It wasn't an ideal solution, but former crew members reported that it was a simple enough task. This visibility issue made night navigation difficult, but the structural flaw wouldn't cause serious problems until the fateful night of Antonio's party. After a dinner in London, Antonio's guests converged on the Thames, where the Marchioness was docked. With their spirits high, ready to party until the early morning, they shuffled onto the party cruiser's narrow decks. She cast off from the dock around 1:25 a.m, and soon after, one of the passengers, Andrew Sutton, found himself feeling uneasy. He headed to the front of the boat with a couple of friends, away from the cramped and stuffy downstairs saloon. I remember, he later said, already getting a bit feverish. It was very narrow downstairs, and that turned to the conversation about the stability of boats and how we could swim in the Thames if it sank. Of course, drowning was not on the rest of the partygoers' minds. They were already enjoying the music from the DJ and the bright, moonlit night on the outer decks. Jonathan Pang remembered feeling an odd sense of unease before boarding the ship, but this soon abated when the Marchioness set off. The atmosphere on board hummed with music from the disco as the pleasure ship drifted beneath the clear summer night sky. However, all was not as it seemed. Now, anyone familiar with the Thames knows that it can be seriously formidable, and those tides are no joke. That night, the river was particularly choppy, and the Marchioness may not have been keeping well to one side. The skipper, Stephen Faldo, had worked the river since he was 17, and he knew its waters very well. He also knew they were very temperamental. As the Marchioness neared the southern pier of the Suffolk Bridge's centre arch, the Marchioness swanned by her running mate, the old Hurlingham, at 3.2 knots. Unbeknownst to everyone on board, they were heading into the same path as something 3 times their ship's size. The aggregate sand dredger Bowbell was the Thames vacuum cleaner designed to suck up aggregates, sand and gravel from the river bottom with a powerful suction hopper. Because the majority of her deck was taken up with the clutter of machinery and gear that stored the dredged sand and material, her wheelhouse was located aft towards the stern. That night, Bowbell was empty and in ballast, and she was trimmed aftwards. Her stern was sunk lower in the water than her bow was, lifting the captain's line of vision. That captain was Douglas Henderson. In his early 30s, that afternoon he'd finished a solo pub crawl that saw him down 6 pints. After a 3-hour nap, he'd started out on the Bowbell with his small crew, which included a helmsman, a deckhand, a lookout who'd drunk a few pints of his own, and a cook who was already asleep on board, also drunk. But the design and condition of his vessel presented serious navigational challenges. Anything low in the water, like a small boat, would have disappeared into a blind spot that could have reached up to 1,000 feet in front of the dredger. Within minutes of passing her running mate on the river, the Marchioness was barrelling down the Thames, heading for the centre arch of the Suffolk Bridge, but she was also headed, unknowingly, right into the Bowbell's course. In the wheelhouse, the base from the party must have thudded through the bulkheads. Slowly but surely enough, though, the Marchioness began to slip into the centre of the channel, buffeted by the currents, and soon she had slipped into the invisible reach of the Bowbell's 160-foot hydrodynamic field. This was considerably long, given the Bowbell was hefty. She had a deadweight tonnage of 1,850 tons. That bulk displaced vast volumes of water, which created zones of high pressure at her bow and stern, and a low-pressure corridor along her sides. All ships experienced this, but the Bowbell was a big vessel operating in a very narrow stretch of water, and there could be no margin for error. Caught within this moving envelope, the Marchioness was first nudged and then pulled sideways at her stern, as though she were on some invisible tow line. Captain Faldo heard a shout. It was Marchioness's mate, Andrew McGowan, yelling out a warning of impending danger, so Faldo nudged his boat's throttle up to full power. The Bowbell, prowling through the river like a shadow in the dark, was about to overtake the Marchioness in her blind spot, which otherwise would have been a simple manoeuvre if the Marchioness had cleared mid-channel. But she didn't. Like the swinging limb of a great beast, the Bowbell cleaved the smaller vessel at her stern at its 5.5 knot pace. Inside, on the dance floor, the boat jolted violently underfoot. Confused partygoers exchanged worried glances, and the mood on board had shifted. Seconds passed in uneasy silence as laughter dissipated and a deep unsettlement lodged in the stomachs of those on board. They instinctively knew something was awfully wrong. And then came a large, onerous groan. It was 1:45 a.m., barely 20 minutes after the Marchioness had set off from the quay, when the celebration was plunged into catastrophe. The Bowbell struck again, harder than before, and the smaller boat was swung around, bulldozing the meagre pleasure cruiser violently over to starboard and flattening on her side like a toy boat. The Marchioness's bulkheads were torn to splinters as the Thames rushed into the lower saloon and the engine room. What followed, in the 30 seconds it took for the boat to sink, would expose the Marchioness's lax safety provisions. During her previous conversions, those passenger spaces had been boxed in with perspex, and escape routes were not clearly marked. Once the pleasure cruiser heeled over, her sliding windows jammed from the pressure, trapping the passengers at a critical moment when seconds could mean life or death. Frantic, passengers clambered on top of each other, attempting to pry the windows open for a way out, but the Marchioness was already at the mercy of the swirling river. Then, in one single, savage motion, the upper saloon was torn completely away as the Bowbell continued to plough across her. The deck planking on both the upper and lower decks snapped into splinters, and the anchor from the bow bell smashed through a window. People were thrashed about, getting crushed under sliding tables and chairs, lacerated from shards of broken glass. One woman was clipped by the bow bell's propeller as it smashed its way through. One survivor of the Marchioness, Andrew Sutton, would later recall looking up from on the deck beside his girlfriend Helen at the bow of the Marchioness, watching something like a monster loom above them. The bow bell, he said, appeared to them as a gargantuan shape that blotted out the night sky. Its lights flickered like a pair of floating eyes. Andrew grabbed his girlfriend's hand, who stood frozen in terror as the upper deck began to tilt, and he shouted, "We have to go now." Together, they leapt into the inky water, hoping to swim away from the wreckage. As the river around them churned with the debris of splintered wood, floating benches, and the remnants of a night shattered in seconds, Andrew's instincts sharpened. The bow bell's side was very close to us, he said, and I could hear the thump-thump of the propellers. I knew we had to get away to avoid being sucked into them, and I started dragging Helen towards the north shore. But Helen's woolen jumper was soaked through, weighing her down like chainmail in that 3-knot tide. For even the most adept swimmer, a single knot could be a challenge, so fighting the water at triple that force was a forlorn hope. Miraculously, they managed to swim clear of the wreck that had begun to sink swiftly down into the riverbed as it was swallowed up with a hiss. Another couple nearby weren't so lucky. They'd been caught in a current that was sending them upstream towards Westminster in the swell of the middle river. As they drifted close up to one of the bridge piers, the rip spiraled them around it. Andrew tried desperately to warn them to swim away from the bridge, but his mouth was filled with water. For a moment, he saw only a pair of blue trousers kicking frantically at the surface as the couple thrashed about, and then the current tugged both of them under, and the river closed over them into stillness. As Andrew and Helen fought their own battle against the current pushing them upstream, he heard a strange sound of fizzing bubbles. It was the air escaping from the Marchioness as the hull was crushed and flooded. With her little hull torn open, the Marchioness had lost buoyancy in seconds. The lucky few who had been on the upper deck when she sank managed to escape, but many then had to contend with the river itself. Fortunately, the passengers and crew aboard the Marchioness's running mate, Hurlingham, had witnessed the calamity and began tossing life preservers into the water. Finally, at 1:50 a.m., 5 minutes after the collision, the Thames Navigation Service called upon all available help from the nearby boats. Among them was the launch Royal Princess, who joined the rescue effort from Blackfriars Bridge, casting its own life preservers in for the flailing survivors. The Marchioness's own feeble 4 life preservers had bobbed to the surface, and those lucky enough to be in range mustered one final surge of energy, grabbing hold of anything that would carry them to the safety of the riverbank, or towards the Hurlingham, where the crew were furiously plucking survivors from out of the water. One of the night's most valiant acts came from the Marchioness crewman Andrew McGowan. When the bow bell had first hit, he was thrown clear of the pleasure boat, but rather than swim to shore and save himself, he made back for the settling Marchioness. Hoisting himself from the water and climbing onto the hull, McGowan pried open one of the doors to the dance floor. With a clear exit suddenly having manifested, beleaguered passengers clambered out as fast as they could. It was a split-second decision that had saved lives, undoubtedly heroic. But unfortunately, the bow bell did not display this same heroism. The dredger could have played a decisive role in saving lives immediately after the collision. She was, after all, the biggest vessel on the scene by far. Instead, her captain, Douglas Henderson, made the bewildering decision to motor onwards without attempting to help. Henderson simply radioed the Thames Navigation Service with a message that was strikingly indifferent. "I have to get underway now and proceed out through the bridges," he said. "I believe I've struck a pleasure craft. It has sunk. I'm getting clear of the bridges now. I was distracted by flashing lights from another pleasure craft. My vessel was proceeding outward bound, just approaching Cannon Street Bridge, and well, I just lost steerage, and I don't know after that. I can't really say anything else." Fighting the currents upstream, meanwhile, Andrew Sutton and his girlfriend Helen passed other boats and barges moored along the river, but everything they tried to grasp onto was slick with algae. As the lights of the south bank drifted past, Andrew remembered seeing London from an angle no one normally sees, and then, he said, being struck by the absurdity of having that thought while fighting for his life. After a few minutes, the police rescue boats whizzed downstream to the side of the collision, after having gone to the wrong place on the Thames, but none could see Andrew or his girlfriend. But as luck would have it, Sutton was able to grasp a hold of netting in the water near the Oxo Tower, where he could force Helen's arms under to keep her afloat. It had been almost half an hour since they'd been flung into the water. Exhausted, their bodies were ready to give out, but as Andrew was about to lose consciousness, a policeman dragged him and Helen out of the water, hurling them onto the floor of a police boat. The pair had drifted over a mile upstream as the tide came in. Andrew and Helen were among the last pulled alive from the water, and not a single person survived past the 30-minute mark. Next day, by 9 a.m, the river had become a recovery site rather than a rescue scene. Police divers began the grim task of retrieving the bodies of the drowned, while the wreck of the Marchioness was located and beached later that same day. Stranded at high tide on the riverbanks, it was a pathetic sight. The upper superstructure had been torn completely away, revealing the planking of the dance floor, which just hours ago people had been enjoying. London was horrified by the tragedy that had taken place in full view of partygoers and those casually strolling the Thames, and throughout the next week, police and forensics teams scoured the riverbanks relentlessly. The cost had been appalling. 51 were dead, while 80 survived. Among the victims were Stephen Faldo, the Marchioness's skipper, and Antonio de Vasconcellos, the birthday boy. The average age of the passengers on board that night was 22, those whose lives had barely begun, but which now had already ended.
Well, within 10, 15 seconds, it just went to the side, all the people went to one side, and it just hit the water. And everybody's panicking on our boat.
I mean, I dived out the window, so there were lots of the people downstairs. I don't know, I mean, there's no way they would have got out.
How long did it take for the boat to sink?
But I don't know, about 2-3 minutes.
I dived off and was taken by the tide, and I allowed the tide to take me, and it took me through and underneath and out the other side.
What happened to other people on the boat, did you know?
I didn't look back.
The ordeal suffered by the Marchioness's victims and survivors was bad enough, but the disaster left lingering doubts and questions which needed to be answered. How did the Bowbell not see the Marchioness in time, and why didn't she stop and render assistance? Well, this kicked off a clown show of investigations, inquiries and trials which would last for the next 13 years. Shockingly, the Marine Accidents Investigation Branch, or MAIB Chief Inspector, decided not to hold a public inquiry into the events, despite the trauma and the horror that had been inflicted on survivors and families alike. Cecil Parkinson, then Secretary of State for Transport, rejected demands for a public inquiry, claiming instead that the MAIB itself would be impartial and thorough. Needless to say, it wasn't. 2 years after the incident in 1991, Captain Henderson from the Bowbell was charged twice with manslaughter and gross negligence. The prosecution's case rested on two sections of the Merchant Shipping Act's 1984, which essentially said that a captain can be charged with failing to give assistance and information after a collision. Although Henderson had the capacity to rescue everybody aboard Bowbell alone, he chose instead to leave behind dozens of victims in the polluted, ice-cold waters of the Thames. Why? Well, in subsequent evidence, he suggested that as regards launching lifebuoys from his vessel, quote, "At the time, it was not a matter that was one of my top priorities. I did not give any consideration to releasing them. I realised something was wrong," he said, and ran to the stern of the vessel. "I left the helmsman at the bridge. I can't recall exactly what happened because it all became a blur. The best course of action," he went on, "was to get clear of the area." Now, naturally, Henderson has been torn apart for these words. They read as extremely insensitive. There is some modicum of truth to his statement. As master of the Bowbell, his first priority was to ascertain the status of his own ship before rendering aid. In fact, directly after the collision, Bowbell was out of control. She slammed into the Cannon Street Bridge and was partly damaged. Clearly, Henderson had some issues to deal with, but very quickly, any lubber could have seen that the Bowbell was not in danger of foundering herself. Quickly evacuating the area was a huge error. What's worse, Henderson lied to the police. He misled them on the number of lookouts actually aboard Bowbell that night by retroactively assigning a deckhand the role of lookout when in reality only one man had been tasked with the job. Since the MAIB investigation relied solely on police interviews rather than any direct survivor testimony, the Crown Prosecution Service accepted a skewed version of events. Investigations found that the 6 pints of lager that Henderson had drunk that night before the disaster had no bearing on his actions. After 2 trials, the jury failed to reach a verdict, and Henderson was incredibly acquitted, and kept his license, serving on ships, to this day. In 2001, an investigation found that Henderson had won his master's certificate by forging other certifications and testimonies during the 1980s. But all that aside, what's extremely telling to me are Henderson's communications immediately after the Marchioness was hit. He had radioed saying, "I have to get underway now and proceed out through the bridges. I believe I've struck a pleasure craft. It has sunk. I'm getting clear of the bridges now. I was distracted by flashing lights from another pleasure craft. My vessel was proceeding outward bound, just approaching Cannon Street Bridge, and, well, I just lost steerage, and I don't know after that. I can't really say anything else." Notice how his immediate priority in that exchange is to blame another vessel for distracting him, and then some kind of vague inference that he'd lost steerage or control of his vessel. Clearly, from the very outset, Henderson just wanted to dodge all blame. Just last year, in January 2025, the Mirror reported Henderson had allegedly refused to provide a breathalyzer reading after a customs officer suspected him of being drunk on duty aboard a ship. But back in 1991, this was all a very profound failure of justice, and the family and friends of the victims were understandably pissed off. In response, they formed the Marchioness Action Group, which built pressure to instigate a series of government investigations into the incident. Things were about to get very grim, and honestly, quite weird, because soon there would come a horrifying discovery. The families learnt years later that the hands of 25 of the victims had been removed from the bodies for identification purposes. This chapter of the Marchioness story is extremely grim and very sad. If you're interested in the specifics of this, I'd recommend you check out Caitlin Doty's fantastic video on the subject, because it goes into great detail on the procedures of the coroner and why the hands were removed in the first place. Suffice it to say, the whole thing stank of some kind of cover-up, especially since the coroner, Paul Knapman, refused to resume an inquest into the deaths. In March 1992, one conservative news outlet released the article Cover Up, in which Knapman accused one of the grieving mothers of being unhinged, and had even shown the journalists photos of the victims without the family's consent. Knapman was eventually stood down and replaced. It had been a very ugly chapter in an already horrific story. By now, the families were understandably exhausted, and the press would only capitalise on that grief. Some news articles framed the deceased as morally shallow, privileged yuppies who had their fate coming to them. It was a dirty, shameless way to frame the tragedy. These were just kids in their prime, simply celebrating life. It was the height of the AIDS crisis too, and the fact that many of the victims had been young, wealthy and gay was fueling a kind of apathy, especially from the press. The inquests finally resumed in March and April of 1995 to get to the bottom, maybe, of what had happened over a half-decade prior, and yet there was still insufficient means to prosecute Henderson for two main reasons. First was that the Marchioness had seemingly changed course at the last minute, crossing the path of the Bowbell, which led to the two vessels colliding. Of course, we don't have Captain Faldo's testimony. He died with the Marchioness, but it's thought that he had wrestled with his boat to keep it on course, but the current, acting against his vessel's bow, was making things difficult for him. The Marchioness was a long, slim boat with a very narrow beam. She could have been buffeted about with ease and sent into mid-channel on the river, straight into the path of the Bowbell as she came in. But the second, and perhaps the main reason that seemed to absolve Bowbell's Captain Henderson of all liability, was the fact that both vessels had very poor visibility by design. On the Marchioness, the upper saloon inhibited vision aft from the wheelhouse, giving her a blind spot directly astern. But for the Bowbell, its visibility, or lack thereof, was far worse. Trimmed astern and with a wheelhouse well aft, the ship's crew had something like a 1,000-foot blind spot in front of them. Lookout Terence Blaney had also been drinking that night. He had no bell or speaking trumpet. He could only yell to warn of any incoming hazards, and hope that his voice would carry 260 feet backwards to the wheelhouse. He testified that he'd spotted the Marchioness at 45 metres, nearly 150 feet distant, and that the smaller boat had simply swerved into the Bowbell's path. But it would take the Bowbell just 16 seconds to cover that distance at 5.5 knots. Clearly, visibility was just nowhere near good enough. But the Marchioness Action Group would not stop in their pursuit of justice for the victims. So once the Labour Party had replaced the Conservative government in 1997, the MAG positioned the Secretary of State for the Environment, Transport and the Regions to open an inquest. This finally took place in late 2000, with the final report coming to the conclusion that the parent companies of both the Marchioness and the Bowbell were responsible for the incident. One of the more striking pieces of evidence that the report found was a warning issued 6 years before the disaster, when an official had said, as things stood, it was not a case of if a serious accident occurred, but when, because the Marchioness was in fact not the first vessel on the Thames that the Bowbell had hit. Far, far from it. In 1983, Bowbell had hit a passenger launch, and 5 years later, the Department of Transport issued clear marine guidance on visibility, warning that no more than 524 feet of a ship's view from the bridge should be obscured, because on narrow waterways like the Thames, it was obviously a recipe for disaster. But the warning went unheeded. In November, that same year, the Bowbell ploughed straight into her own sister ship because of her missing lookout. Only months later, in February 1988, she struck the Southwark Bridge. Even when the DOT finally intervened in July 1988, placing a prohibition order on the Bowbell, she was back on the water within weeks. It seems amazing that so many incidents and accidents should be overlooked, and yet they were. Fresh waterways and small boats were less thoroughly scrutinised than their ocean-going equivalents back then. There was a kind of laissez-faire attitude by companies running the gauntlet to make a buck. Take the Marchioness herself. Clearly, very little thought had been given to safety during her conversion into a party boat, with those big enclosed dance floors on the saloons offering very few routes for quick escape, and the upper saloon creating a massive natural blind spot. Report findings reflected the appallingly lacklustre regulations within the commercial enterprises that owned the boats on the Thames. It would ultimately hold no one accountable for the Marchioness disaster, but at the very least it would lead to change. After the 2001 report, RNLI lifeboat stations have opened around the Thames at Chiswick, Gravesend, Teddington, and Tower, saving hundreds of lives and providing extremely rapid response to any incidents. Their E-class lifeboats are the fastest in the fleet, and they were designed specifically for the Thames. They can roar in at 40 knots, carry 21 survivors, and they're loaded with resuscitation kits and oxygen bottles. They're a very impressive bit of kit. Aside from that, a bank of CCTV cameras have been installed along the river, and they're all linked directly to the Metropolitan Police. It's been decades since the Marchioness disaster, and yet families and survivors still grieve. In hindsight, it was a disaster waiting to happen, but it was one that overhauled safety regulations on the Thames. Bowbell met a sad fate herself. After the dredger was sold, she broke up and sank off Portugal in 1997 with the loss of one crewman. All too often we hear the phrase, safety lessons are written in blood, and the Marchioness is just one of those many cases where everything aligned to create the worst possible scenario. It has some striking similarities with the sinking of the Princess Alice from way back in 1878. The Thames is just not a waterway that allows for complacency. It may be in the very heart of a city, but it's dangerous and it deserves plenty of respect.